Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a really fascinating historical journey to look at one of the most heavily guarded and tense borders on the entire planet, tracing it all the way back to its origins. We are going to unpack exactly why the Korean Peninsula split into two radically different nations and how one singular, rushed moment in history ended up shaping the destiny of millions of people.
Okay, let's dive into this. How on earth did a meaningless line on a map divide a whole nation for 80 years? I mean, it sounds completely absurd, doesn't it? The idea that a totally arbitrary boundary could become this massive global flashpoint, altering the lives of generations and completely shaping global geopolitics for decades. But that is exactly what happened, and we're going to explore exactly how it all unfolded.
And here is exactly why this matters right now. The Korean War ended in an armistice, not a formal peace treaty. So, technically speaking, North and South Korea are actually still at war today. The intense military standoff we constantly see on the news, the nuclear anxieties, the heavily fortified borders, all of it is the direct, lasting result of an unfinished conflict from over 70 years ago. To really make sense of today's headlines, we absolutely have to understand this history.
So here's our roadmap for the explainer today. First, the 1945 power vacuum. Second, drawing the 38th parallel. Third, two leaders, two nations. Fourth, the 1950 invasion explodes. And finally, the permanent standoff.
All right, let's jump into Section 1. The 1945 power vacuum, the end of an empire.
To truly understand the split, we kind of have to set the stage of the Korean Peninsula right before its infamous division. So, back in 1905, the entire Korean Peninsula fell under Japanese occupation. Japan presented it as this civilizing project, but for the Koreans, it was quite the opposite. Japan basically ran Korea like a military colony. We're talking armed teachers, a massive police force, and just siphoning away the country's wealth and resources. Naturally, this brutal rule sparked some fierce resentment. By 1937, a young communist guerrilla leader named Kim Il-sung gained immense fame at the Battle of Pochambo, establishing his reputation as a fierce anti-Japanese resistance fighter. But the real turning point? That hits in 1945. With the end of World War II, Japan's empire totally collapsed, and this created a massive, immediate power vacuum in Korea. Almost overnight, forces from the Soviet Union entered a liberated Korea from the north, while United States forces landed down in the south.
Moving right along to Section 2, drawing the 38th parallel, a hasty boundary.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that number right there, 30. With two global superpowers suddenly occupying the exact same peninsula, they needed a quick way to separate their zones of control. And it took just 30 minutes, literally half an hour, for two relatively random American colonels to choose the 38th parallel as the dividing line between the Soviet and American occupation zones. The 38th parallel was, up until that point, a previously meaningless line on a map. I mean, Korea had no natural north-south division, and essentially everyone there wanted a united peninsula. Yet this incredibly hasty 30-minute decision locked in one of the most important and dangerous borders in the world for the next 80 years.
Next up, Section 3. Two leaders, two nations, the ideological chasm.
So, what was supposed to be a temporarily administrative boundary quickly hardened into a permanent ideological barrier, completely fueled by the rapidly emerging Cold War. The peninsula was split between two contrasting governments with completely incompatible visions. Up in the north, you had Kim Il-sung, chosen and backed by the Soviet Union. He was intensely focused on communist land reforms, basically seizing land from landlords without compensation, and driving heavy industrial growth. Meanwhile, down in the south, you had Syngman Rhee. He was backed by the US and the UN, aligning the southern half of the peninsula with capitalist models under the oversight of American General John R. Hodge. These two leaders represented entirely opposing worldviews, and honestly, neither was willing to compromise their vision for a unified Korea.
So how exactly did this lead to two permanent countries? Well, the newly formed United Nations attempted to step in and hold peninsula-wide 3 elections to finally just unify the country. However, the USSR completely refused to cooperate, opposing the elections in the north. Because of that, the UN proceeded with elections only in the south, and this created a tragic domino effect. In August 1948, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, was born under Syngman Rhee. As far as the UN was concerned, this was the only true Korean government. But then, just weeks later, in September 1948, the North responded by writing their own constitution and declaring themselves the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with Kim Il-sung as premier. So that failure to agree on elections directly resulted in the creation of two entirely separate, deeply hostile governments.
Which brings us to Section 4. The 1950 invasion explodes, the spark of war.
Keep in mind, both of these leaders claimed to be the sole legitimate government of all of Korea, and both desperately wanted reunification under their own terms. It was an inevitable boiling point where these ideological differences finally turned into devastating physical warfare. And this brilliantly illustrates the staggering military mismatch right before the invasion. Just look at these numbers. The North Korean army outnumbered the South 2-1 in infantry. Their air force advantage was more than 10-1. But most crucially, thanks to massive Soviet supply lines, North Korea had almost 300 modern tanks, while South Korea had absolutely zero, not one. This overwhelming Soviet-supplied advantage gave Kim Il-sung the confidence to invade, and it allowed the North to completely overrun the border and capture Seoul in just 5 days.
The resulting war was just brutal, with these massive back-and-forth swings. It's almost like a giant, devastating pendulum. In June 1950, the North invades and captures Seoul, and the South Korean army essentially collapsed. But then, the global superpowers were dragged right into the fight. In September 1950, UN forces, led by the US, landed at Incheon in this massive amphibious assault. It completely shattered the North's army and pushed them all the way back into the North. But, just when it looked like the UN would unify Korea under the South's flag, China intervened. In October 1950, tens of thousands of Chinese troops poured over the border, pushing the UN forces right back down across the 38th parallel.
As the frontline armies eventually ground into this stubborn, bloody stalemate, the true horror of the war was felt from the sky. 80%. Just let that sink in for a second. An estimated 80% of North Korea's buildings were completely flattened by an unrelenting US bombing campaign. Entire cities and villages were just wiped off the map, and it's estimated that roughly 10% of the North Korean population was killed by the bombings alone.
Consider this incredibly chilling quote from the U.S. General in charge of the Air Forces. Back in October 1950, the Air Force stopped sending bombers out simply because there was nothing left to bomb. I mean, wow, there was literally nothing left. This absolute, near-total destruction from the sky is absolutely crucial to understand. It forged a deep-seated, enduring hatred of the United States that pervades North Korean state and society to this very day. Whatever ideological disagreements existed before the conflict, it is this sheer trauma and devastation that really became the foundational pillar for North Korean propaganda, fueling their extreme isolation and ongoing military hostility today.
And that brings us to our final section. Section 5, The Permanent Standoff, a War Without End. After years of this brutal trench-style warfare with massive casualties but basically no significant territory-changing hands, the explosive conflict finally ground to a halt. So the crucial point is what happened on July 27, 1953. The opposing sides signed an armistice, and by definition, an armistice is simply a military ceasefire, an agreement to stop fighting. It is not a formal peace treaty. This agreement set up the internationally monitored Demilitarized Zone, or the DMZ, right along the border. The Korean War didn't end, it merely paused. It locked the peninsula into a tense, heavily armed, 70-year standoff that still threatens to spill over at literally any moment. Which brings us to one final thought to leave you with today. If a hasty, 30-minute decision by two colonels could literally divide a nation, trap millions of people, and completely shape global politics for 80 years, what will it actually take to finally erase the 38th parallel? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helped clarify exactly how and why the Korean Peninsula split, giving you the historical context you need for the headlines we see today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.